Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise, and I want to thank you for tuning in for some Texas history. I want to begin today by thanking everyone for the universally positive feedback on the 50th episode of Wise About Texas and the origins of the Texas Rangers. That episode made the point that though there's a lot of discussion around when the official Texas Rangers started, the ranging function was critical to pre-Republic and early Republic Texas. So it really didn't matter when the official Texas Rangers got their start, although it is very fun to discuss. It just matters that the phenomenon of the Ranger began in the earliest settlement periods of Texas and, of course, continues to today with some evolution, of course, in the way they do their business. And I'm looking forward to some great episodes. I've got some great suggestions coming in from that last episode. And we're going to talk a lot about the individuals who served in the Rangers. And we're going to talk a lot about great episodes in Ranger history. So thank you very much for so many of you listening to that. And we got a lot of new listeners from that episode. Well, we're in the high holy days of Texas history between the fall of the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto, and this is a great time to talk about things related to the Revolution, and we're going to do that today. There are many celebrations around the state during this time, so keep that in mind, and no matter where you are, go out and celebrate Texas independence. San Jacinto Day is coming up. We all know that's April 21st. It falls on a Saturday this year, so I've dubbed the week before San Jacinto Week, and I'll be speaking on April 18th at the annual dinner benefiting the San Jacinto Museum. I'm looking forward to that, and definitely will be with my family on April 21st at the San Jacinto Battleground for the annual San Jacinto Day Remembrance, which is in the morning at 10 o'clock, I believe, and the battle reenactment will be that afternoon. There'll be a festival around those events on the battleground, and it's always a great time. I've been taking my daughter out there since she was about 3, and that's something we always look forward to, so I hope to see you out there. If you see me out there, please be sure and stop me and say hello. Well, I was looking for a topic for this episode, something to do with the Revolution that maybe we don't always think about during this time, and one just fell into my lap from listener Paul Poskey in College Station, Texas. Paul works for Texas A&M University, and I want to thank him for the idea for this episode. We've all heard of the fact that the Texas Army had 2 cannon on the field at San Jacinto, our only artillery. We've also heard of the runaway scrape where the settlers of Texas fled the advancing Mexican army from west to east. And these 2 events had something very important in common, and it was a boat. So let's go back to the 1830s and get wise about Texas. We're going to start our discussion today with an individual named James Morgan. Morgan served as an agent in Texas for some land speculators from New York. He acquired some land from Lorenzo de Zavala, and that land today is known as Morgan's Point. He acquired that land to build a town. He took, also in connection with that endeavor, he took delivery of 2 boats, and the intent was for those boats to not only serve in building the new community, but also to make some money for the company. One of those boats was 65 or 70 feet long and weighed about 77 tons. The boat was commissioned on November 2nd, 1835, and it was actually registered to John Austin. John Austin was Stephen F. Austin's cousin, and Morgan had hired Austin up in Connecticut to acquire the ships. The ships were built in Connecticut. Morgan hired a captain for one of the boats named Luke Falville. Falville was an Irish immigrant. He had become a U.S. citizen on October 9th, 1835, was married to a lady named Mary Falville, who eventually came with him to Texas. This boat that we're going to talk about today was called the Flash. The Flash made its way to Texas, carrying both passengers and cargo. One of the things that I found out about this trip, somebody wrote about it and alleges that Emily West was one of the passengers on the Flash that came in November of 1835. Now, Emily West, you'll remember from other episodes, is referred to in history as the Yellow Rose of Texas. And what we know for sure about Emily is that she was an indentured servant. She was not a slave, despite many accounts that refer to her as such. She was an indentured servant and of James Morgan. She did come from New Haven, Connecticut, just like the Flash, to Morgan's Point, or New Washington as the town was going to be called. So she very well could have been on the Flash because she was going to be working for Morgan. But her passport that she obtained later, after the Battle of San Jacinto, indicated that she had come to Texas in September 1835, and this voyage of the Flash to Texas after its commissioning was in November 1835, so we certainly can't be sure, but maybe she did come, which would have been the first significant cargo for Texas history that the Flash had brought. Well, the Flash stopped to pick up James Morgan in New Orleans. History records that Morgan met the boat in what was then called La Balize and is now called Pilot Town. Now, this is a very interesting part of the New Orleans area. Many, many miles down the Mississippi from New Orleans toward the mouth is where the river pilots would live and work, and there's an area that was started back in this time called La Balize, which became Pilot Town. Now, after Hurricane Katrina, Pilot Town was largely destroyed, but it has a great history of its own, and that's where James Morgan was in 1835. He got on board the Flash, and they arrived at the point that would become New Washington. Morgan sent the Flash back to New Orleans with, as you might expect, cotton, as well as some other things from Texas. There's a manifest for January 23rd, 1836, that's preserved from the New Orleans port records that indicates that the ship carried, quote, 3 jackasses. Now, we presume those were the 4-legged kind, but it does not specify. Interestingly, on that manifest, the ship also was carrying the captain's wife, Mary Falville. So Mary had come to Texas and then quickly returned in January 1836 to New Orleans. She was listed as traveling with 3 trunks and 3 hat boxes, so it appears as if she was moving back to New Orleans at this time. Well, that wouldn't be surprising, because if you recall the time period, January 1836, we had already seized Behar the previous December. Santa Anna was gathering the army to come into Texas, and the government meetings were starting in earnest in Washington on the Brazos. And so war was definitely on the horizon, so it wouldn't be surprising if Captain Falville had sent his wife Mary back home to New Orleans, because certainly his level of activity and the Flash's level of activity would be about to increase. Well, the Flash made another run to New Orleans and arrived, this is a different trip, arriving March 7th, 1837, and looking at that manifest, it was carrying hides, it was carrying cotton, in regular commerce. It also had a few passengers aboard. By this time, though, Luke Falville was not merely a ship captain. He was a captain in the Texas Navy. And on March 2nd, 1836, he had been commissioned as a captain in the Texas Navy. That's reflected on some documents I found in the state archives. Later in Falville's life, some affidavits filed reflecting that as his commission date. The Flash had another commission of sorts. An 18-pound cannon had been mounted on her deck. Now, you'll remember from the last episode about the Texas Rangers, I mentioned a law that Stephen F. Austin wanted to use to try to solve the Indian problem he perceived in Texas. And the law said that it was illegal for the U.S. To assist a nation that was at war with an ally of the U.S. And Austin wanted to use that law against the Indians, with Mexico being an ally, but was unsuccessful in doing that. Well, that law came into play again because the Flash and other ships were used as privateers to, remember, the Flash was privately owned, used as privateers to harass Mexican shipping. But that was a very controversial situation at the time in the U.S. If you'll remember back to episode 1 of this podcast, when we were talking about our old friend Judge Benjamin Cromwell Franklin, we talked about a case he adjudicated involving the capture of a U.S. ship called the Pocket by the Texian schooner Independence and the controversy that caused in the U.S. So the Flash was poised to face a similar problem when it cruised up and down the Gulf Coast with that 18-pound cannon. Well, it did return to New Orleans and then headed back to Texas, and it headed back to Texas with some interesting cargo aboard. First, aboard the Flash was Marabou Bonaparte Lamar. Now, you recognize that name. Marabou Lamar ended up being the second president of the Republic of Texas and achieved some heroics as a member of the cavalry the day before the Battle of San Jacinto. In fact, he almost started the Battle of San Jacinto one day early. He had come from Georgia and then traveled from New Orleans on the Flash. The other interesting bit of cargo on the Flash on this trip was a huge grocery order. And this grocery order had been placed by a certain lady that played a big role in episode 5 of Wise About Texas. That's the Capitals of Texas, part 2. Her name was Angelina Eberly. You remember Angelina Eberly? She's the one that ended up firing the town cannon of Austin at the General Land Office to scare off the people that Sam Houston had sent to secret the archives out of Austin and hopefully return the capital to Houston. That was called the Archives War, and if you remember the end of that episode, I speculated that maybe that war is not over yet. But Angelina Eberly, she owned a hotel in Austin during that time, but in the spring of 1836, she was Angelina Peyton, and she was operating a tavern and hotel in San Felipe called Peyton's Tavern. San Felipe, of course, being the capital of Austin's colony and a thriving town on the Brazos. Well, the Flash landed from New Orleans at Velasco on March 25th, 1836. Now, you can see we're getting really close to the Battle of San Jacinto. The Alamo had fallen by then. That was 2 days before the massacre at Goliad. And the Flash landed with this grocery order. Now, the plan would have been, of course, for Lamar to go up the Brazos and join the Army, and for Angelina Eberly, or Peyton Eberly's groceries, to have been shipped up the Brazos to San Felipe to her tavern. But we had a problem by this point. You see, when the Flash would have stopped in Galveston, and in Galveston would have discovered that its owner, James Morgan, was now Colonel James Morgan of the Texas Army. We had only declared independence 23 days prior, so Texas was now at war with full-fledged war with Mexico. Morgan was a colonel. The Flash would have landed at Galveston. Everybody on board would have learned that the Alamo had fallen and that Santa Anna was advancing to the east, that the settlers were fleeing, that Houston and the Army were retreating or counter-marching, depending on your perspective of those events. So the situation had definitely changed, and Fauvel's orders at this point changed as well. So Fauvel was ordered by Colonel Morgan to take the Flash to Velasco and to meet refugees from the runaway scrape that would have fled down the Brazos. So on that landing, March 25th at Velasco, Fauvel was there to pick up the people that were fleeing. Well, he did so. He picked up a lot of passengers, and he cruised around the Texas coast, probably picking up other passengers and keeping them safe from the Mexican Army. Well, those passengers on that boat needed something to eat. Good luck for them, because Angelina Eberly's grocery order was aboard. So, as you might expect, they help themselves. Well, after the war, that did not sit well with Miss Eberly, and if you go to the state archives, as I did, so you don't have to, you will find a claim filed by Angelina Eberly against the government for reimbursement of all of these items. And I went and got the documents, and including, now of course I've got a copy of it, but there is a document she actually signed. And she talks about a considerable amount of bacon, flour, sugar, coffee, and other supplies belonging to her was taken from the schooner Flash, Captain Fauvel, then lying in Galveston Bay, by the officers of the government for public use. So this is a good old-fashioned takings claim under the law. And among the set of documents that are in this file include the interrogatories, which are questions that one side sends to another in a lawsuit that are required to be answered under oath. And then we have Captain Fauvel's response, where he was under the orders. He says in the spring of 1836 he was captain of the schooner Flash. He was under the orders of Colonel James Morgan, commander of Galveston, which was Morgan's assignment in the Army. And he claims that the Flash was laying at the time at New Washington, which was, of course, Morgan's town. Fauvel writes that he had on board a considerable amount of provisions and stores, admittedly belonging to Mrs. Peyton, now Mrs. Eberly, and that he also received on board, as Fauvel writes, quote, the majority of the members of the cabinet of government and their families. Well, we know for a fact that the Secretary of Navy was on board because of another source that I'll tell you about in a minute. But Fauvel admits the provisions belonging to Mrs. Eberly were consumed both by members of the cabinet, their families, and other families then on board who were at the time, quote, flying from the Mexicans, close quote. But some of the flour was put on shore at Galveston, he says, for use of the troops there at Galveston, who would have eventually made their way up to San Jacinto, including, of course, our friend Benjamin Cromwell Franklin. I also found Miss Eberly's affidavit swearing to the truth of her allegations. What I did not find was a full and final resolution of that claim, or whether she got paid. I'm going to guess that she did, because we know from other episodes that Miss Eberly was nothing if not persistent, culminating, of course, in her firing a cannon. Well, there was one more interesting bit of cargo that the Flash picked up at Velasco to take back to Galveston Bay, and that was something that was destined for a trip up the Brazos to meet Sam Houston's army. There were two items, both cannons. Yep, the twin sisters were on board the Flash from Velasco to Galveston. I'm sure you've heard of the twin sisters. They were the two pieces of artillery on the field of San Jacinto. They were the result of a gift from the good people of Cincinnati, Ohio, to the Republic of Texas. There was a meeting in November 17th of 1835 by a meeting of a committee in Cincinnati to support the efforts of the Republic of Texas, and they passed a resolution, and I want to read this. It's short because I think it's a good encapsulation of the feeling around the country toward the Texas Revolution. And here it is, quote, resolved that this meeting cooperate in sentiment and feeling with the independent citizens of Texas in their manly efforts now making in that territory by the late citizens of the United States in maintaining their rights and resisting the aggressions upon them by an unprincipled usurper. That as American citizens, we can do no less than encourage the spirit of freedom wherever or by whatever people it may be displayed, that the violation of the natural and conventional rights of our friends and brethren in Texas is regarded by this meeting with abhorrence and just indignation, and that they do commend in this instance the measures of resistance that have been resorted to, and confidently hope and believe that as sons of the United States of America, the lessons of their fathers will not be lost on their descendants, that, as in the case of the patriotic Greeks, the South Americans, and the Poles, we have a right to cheer them by our sympathies and to aid them in the supplies of clothes and provisions, that we approve of and recommend to the citizens of this meeting a plan by which the citizens of Texas shall be supplied through their agent Mr. Smith by our contributions with such an amount of hollow ware as he may deem sufficient to contain other provisions by which they shall be filled, according to his judgment and sound discretion, that this meeting have every confidence in the integrity and patriotism of Mr. Smith, and no wish or intention to violate any law of their own government, close quote. So I thought that was a very enthusiastic endorsement of the feelings of the people of Cincinnati. They caused two iron, quote, they're quoted as two iron field pieces. Sometimes you see them as brass or bronze, but this says iron, and they were sent from Cincinnati to Texas. They were dispatched to Brazoria, again, like Lamar and the groceries for Angelina Eberly. The thought was that they would go up the Brazos and meet the Army, but of course that was they were a little late. General Houston had heard about it because he had sent for the cannon twice, saying that they needed to be there as soon as possible, but they couldn't take them overland. And as Santa Anna advanced, and of course it was muddy, and you may remember, but the spring of 1836 was very rainy, so the roads were very muddy. They couldn't get them to Sam Houston, so they decided to send them by water, and they sent them down on board a schooner called Pennsylvania to Velasco, and then Luke Falville and the Flash took the cannon from Velasco to Morgan's Point, and the sloop Ohio took them from Morgan's Point up Buffalo Bayou to Harrisburg. They were then pulled overland from Harrisburg and ended up meeting Houston's army at Gross's Plantation on April 11th. It was April 11th, 1836, after Houston had crossed the Brazos at Gross's Plantation. Remember, he had stopped and trained his troops on the west side of the Brazos, and then he crossed, and the twin sisters met him there at the plantation, and they proceeded on to their destiny. Now, one of the great mysteries in Texas history is what happened to the twin sisters. Never fear. We will address that. That's going to have to be its own episode, though, because the search for the twin sisters continues. There's no confident resolution as to where they are. I do have a friend whose ancestors go back to this time period. They were very active in the Revolution. He has his own theory about where they might be, and so I'm going to meet with him on that and gather all the information that we can, and we'll do an episode on the fate of the twin sisters. One final mention about the Flash. There's some, if you do research on this, there's some writing that indicates that the Pennsylvania took the twin sisters to Morgan's Point and not the Flash, but I have in my hands a freight bill from James Morgan to the government of Texas, and approved by Robert Potter, the Secretary of the Navy of the Republic. And part of the freight bill is the 2 carriages, 2 pieces cannon, sundries, 5 cases of shot, and 38 18-pound balls. And that bill came to $289 that he owed Morgan for transporting those cannons. So $289 to assist in freeing Texas, I'd say, is well worth it. So the Flash. So now we're approaching the Battle of San Jacinto. There was what can charitably be described as chaos in the area. Sam Houston was headed down to meet Santa Anna. Santa Anna had detached some of his army, including himself. They had headed to Harrisburg, and really what they were trying to do was capture the government. They had burned Harrisburg. Lorenzo de Zavala had abandoned his house north of San Jacinto. David Burnett, the provisional president of Texas, was going to get his wife and family out. And the Flash was laying at New Washington as Morgan's slaves and other personnel were trying to load up all the belongings and all the things that he wanted to take from his spot at New Washington. Also present there was William Fairfax Gray, who wrote a very well-known diary of the Revolutionary experience, and he described the Secretary of the Navy and other government officials being there at New Washington, and they all tried to escape at one point, got stuck on a bar, were towed off by a steamship, managed to get away in time. Burnett ended up down at New Washington just as Santa Anna arrived, and with his wife, and you'll remember the story of Burnett getting in a rowboat and rowing away just as the Mexican dragoons arrived to capture the provisional president. And the story goes that the dragoons were not allowed to fire on the boat because of the presence of Mrs. Burnett. Well, he rowed that boat out to the Flash, so Burnett ended up getting on the Flash. The Flash made it to Galveston. There were probably about 150 people aboard when they arrived at Galveston. And, of course, that's where the provisional government was on April 21st at 4 o'clock p.m. when in 18 minutes the Texas Army routed the Mexican Army and Texas was free. Well, after the Battle of San Jacinto, as the Republic of Texas began to emerge, the Flash continued her service between Texas and New Orleans and Galveston. Eventually, Captain Falville was replaced, and he was replaced by a captain named Marstella. Well, Marstella apparently was not quite as good a captain because he soon wrecked the Flash in San Luis Pass. Now, there's some discussion about how and when and where that actually happened, but the Flash was lost, and I think the common conclusion is that the Captain Marstella mistook San Luis Pass for the entrance to Galveston Harbor. Now, those two places today look very, very different, but I would imagine back in 1837, one might, if one did not know where one was, mistake San Luis Pass for that entrance. A fatal mistake, because those of you who have spent any time in the Galveston area know that San Luis Pass to this day is very, very dangerous. So the Flash entered and was wrecked. The cargo was a loss, but there was no loss of life, reportedly. Captain Falville ended up living out his days in Galveston. He died in 1872 and was buried in the Catholic Cemetery in Galveston. And his former ship, the Flash had a tremendous record of service in its relatively short life. It transported men, some rather famous, the second president of Texas, commissioned by one of the prominent figures in Texas history, James Morgan. It transported the only artillery the Texas Army had at San Jacinto. It transported groceries for the famous Angelina Eberly, all done in the service of the Republic of Texas. The Flash had a great career and deserves to be remembered as an important contributor to the freedom of Texas. Well, now we come to the part of the episode called Getting There, where I tell you how to go and see some of the places that we talked about in the episode. The port where the twin sisters were picked up by the Flash was Velasco, and we've talked about old Velasco before. It's now Surfside Beach, Texas. So if you go down there, you'll see some historical markers of the port of Velasco at the mouth of the Brazos, and that's always a great place to visit, especially as the sun comes out and we get past winter here in Texas. The twin sisters were taken to New Washington, and if you go down State Highway 146 to Barbers Cut Boulevard and go east, you'll be on Morgan's Point, and there is an old cemetery down there. There are some historical markers down there, and that is the area where New Washington was to be built, where James Morgan had purchased land for his New York investors, and where the Flash spent much of her time. Of course, now it's very busily part of the shipping traffic in and around the Galveston Bay area. Burnett, after he rowed his boat to the Flash and made it to Galveston, had set up shop on the east side of Galveston, Texas, at a place called Fort Point. And if you look at the map, a map that has Fort Point on it, you're not going to be able to get to the exact site of Fort Point because it's on a Coast Guard base. And I've already tried to do that. I pulled up to the guard shack, told them what was there. Of course, the guard didn't know about that site, but that was not something that the Coast Guard was willing to let me just drive around the base and find. So I'll do a little more work on that. Maybe we can, maybe I can get down there sometime and take some pictures. So you're not going to be able to get super close to it. What you can do is go down Seawall Boulevard to the east end of the island where old Fort San Jacinto, a later day fort, was existed. There's some historical markers there. You can see the area where Fort Point was from that spot, and you'll be close enough at that point. Also, the ferry landing in Galveston is just to the west of Fort Point, so you'll be in the same area that all those refugees were in 1836. Luke Falville is buried in the Catholic Cemetery in Galveston, so you can go down there and see the captain's grave. And, of course, we'll conclude this episode by encouraging you to visit the San Jacinto Battleground and Museum. It's always a wonderful place to go any time of year, but as this episode is being released not too distant from San Jacinto Day, make a trip to the San Jacinto Battleground or the nearest revolutionary site that you can find wherever you live and pay tribute to the great men and women who sacrificed so much to bless us with the Texas that we know and love today. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Thank you very much for listening. If you get a chance, leave a review on iTunes. That helps other Texas history lovers find the show. We're on Facebook at Wise About Texas and Twitter and Instagram at Wise About Texas. Please keep the feedback coming. You can email me at host@wiseabouttexas.com. Let me know the stories that you want to talk about. Let me know what you think about this podcast. And go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.